You know, one thing about having as much hair as I do, it never does what you want it to do. Greetings, friends, and mostly enemies. Today, we're doing a world building video, World Building 101. A viewer asked for it, so you know I'm gonna do it. And it's a subject near and dear to my heart. I love world building. For me, world building is like at least half the fun. I mean, I love world building. I've loved it ever since I was a kid. When I was a little kid and I still wanted to design video games for a living, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to design the worlds, I wanted to write the story and design characters. And having gotten to design my own world in my book, it's close to a dream come true. I would still absolutely love to be involved in making video games. Fingers crossed, maybe I can get a game maker to pick up my book like happened for The Witcher. That would be the dream. Oh my god, that would be the dream. So anyways, to get to it. So, in the world building conversation, like so many other things in life, it really helps if we compartmentalize and we structure the conversation into different areas. And the way I typically think about world building is there's three main categories, okay? There's vanilla Earth or Earth-like, there's Earth adjacent, and then there's Brave New World, which is what I write and which, in my opinion, most of the best stories are. So we'll start from one and move forward. So first, vanilla Earth or Earth-like. In an Earth-like world, like the name implies, the world building is basically built in for you. You don't need to invent new societies, you don't need to invent new cultures, you don't need to build geography, you don't need to explain how things look, because we all live on planet Earth. And so the world building, if your world is set on an Earth that is basically the same as our Earth, you really don't have to try super hard to do the world building. You can really rely on people's existing knowledge. And in contemporary fiction, people are usually completely okay with that. You know, you don't typically see contemporary fiction fans bitching about a lack of world building in my experience. The one thing that you do have to consider when you're looking at world building in a vanilla Earth is that inevitably you're going to have to change one or two things to make the story interesting. So make your changes consistent, make sure they have logical follow through. Don't make chocolate never exist and then still have things that are made using chocolate exist. You know what I'm saying? Make sure your change is logically consistent, and that applies to all world building. But you know, those minor changes typically take place in contemporary fiction, sometimes to help the story along or to act as a storytelling device. And so that's the one thing about world building in contemporary fiction that I can just remind you of. You need to be logically consistent and follow through with your changes if you make any little tweaks to the world in contemporary fiction. So next, we move into Earth adjacent. And in Earth adjacent, things start getting interesting. In Earth adjacent, we have things like the Marvel Universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel, I think it's 616 is the standard canon Marvel Universe in the comics. We have things like the Dresden Files. We have things like Red Rising. We have things like Stargate. All those things are in Earth adjacent realities, where the Earth is the fundamental building block. We're set on Earth. It's just physics have been tweaked, and history has been tweaked, and the reality of the situation has all been tweaked to allow these fantastical events and things to take place, these fantastical people to exist, etc., etc. So in an Earth-adjacent world, you're allowed to change, add, and subtract anything you want. But again, the most important thing with world building, and especially in Earth-adjacent, is logical consistency and making sure you follow that change through all of its tendrils, okay? If you have an Earth-adjacent world where the dinosaurs never went extinct but humans still evolved, that's going to be a completely different world. Different history, different science, different religions, different politics, different cultures. Nothing from this Earth would survive in a Earth where dinosaurs existed. Everything would be vastly different. It would be unrecognizable. And so if you wrote a fiction where it was Earth, but with dinosaurs, and your explanation was basically that, and you didn't flesh out your world, readers would put it down like that. It wouldn't be a fun read. It would be so lazy and on its face, lackadaisical in its world building. It would just be, ugh. It would be bad. It would be bad. So, in a major change like that, you definitely need to follow that logical path through all of its possibilities and be very thorough and really let your imagination populate this world with new things, because you can't carry over stuff from human culture into a world where history is so fundamentally different like that. The geography, you could argue, would still pretty much be the same, because even without the meteors, there's still a good chance Pangea would have broken up and all that other good stuff. So, now let's take another example of an Earth-adjacent potential world. Let's say we have a version of Earth where no mainstream religion ever took hold of the social conversation, never took hold of the populace, okay? Now, if you watch a lot of TV or if you read a lot, you've encountered this scenario plenty of times. And one of the popular iterations of this scenario is humans would be so many more years advanced, right? That right now in 2021, we would have flying cars and regenerating limbs, and we would have cured AIDS and all this other stuff. And that's certainly a possibility, but I counter with this. It's also quite possibly that it would be the exact opposite. If you do your history research, you know that for a large part of human history and in many countries, the church was the bastion of scientific study and discovery. The Gregorian calendar, physics, chemistry, astrology, all of these things were studied by church scientists in some places. My point is that the church was a haven of knowledge for many, many years and in many places in human history. And so it's quite possible that if you removed the existence of religion from human history, right now in 2021, we would be where we were 500 years ago. It's quite possible. And if anyone tells you otherwise, they don't know their history. They're straight up lying to you. They're completely ignorant of history. So, in quick summary of Earth Adjacent, again, follow any change you make, addition, subtraction, or change through its logical conclusion. If you take something out that's part of other things, you need to take all those other things out or change them to accommodate the thing that's now missing. So again, the chocolate analogy. If the cocoa plant doesn't exist on your Earth, chocolate donuts can't exist. Tiramisu can't exist. Chocolate lattes can't exist, etc., etc. Make sure you're logically consistent and follow through with your change, because if you're not consistent, it can be a big plot hole or just look like sloppy, lazy writing, and both of them are very bad. The other little note there is that you can employ suspension of disbelief. We as writers kind of rely on that particular tool in our kit heavily, but it's not going to save you from yourself. So, do not count on suspension of disbelief to save you from yourself. It'll backfire on you. And now we get to my favorite, Brave New World. In a Brave New World, you're literally starting from the ground up, and sometimes from empty space up. I mean, you can start from the most barest minimum you want and start working your way up when you're doing Brave New World. Let your imagination run wild first, apply logic and common sense second. That's what I would do when you're doing Brave New World. Just let every little idea come to you and get it in your head and lock it down with a few words, jot it down, on to the next idea. Then, once you got all your ideas out, start fleshing them out, put it all together in a world, and then do a logical sweep through of that world and connect everything and make sure everything's consistent. Don't skip that logical step. Now, when you're building your world and when you're even having a conversation about world building, what you have to remember is that any world building you do needs to complement the story you have planned. You don't need to have your story fully written or even detailed outline drawn up, but you do need to have the basic storyline in your head and the basic cast of characters so that you can make a world that complements them. Okay? So for example, we're not gonna write a story about seafaring pirates and put them in a fantasy world that's 95% landmass. It's gonna be a pretty lame fucking book. But if we make them sky pirates, well, now that works. Now we're off to the races, right? So make sure your world complements the story you're trying to tell. Do not put your pirates in the disadvantageous juxtaposition of giving them no sea to sail on. Put them in the sky. All right, so as promised, here you can see my world's map. Over on the right, we have the MS Paint version that I made for my own use when I was writing the book, so I had something visual to reference to keep myself consistent. And over on the left, we have the professional version that the artist made. Now, the reason this is relevant to our conversation is this map is intensely relevant to my world building. This map allows me to stay consistent and know exactly where my characters are in space, what they're doing, where they're going, etc., etc. It also gives me a map of what they would know geography-wise. Using this map, I can have my characters say things about the geography and keep myself consistent in the writing. I can have them reference the mountains and the lake, and it feels very organic because these are things people talk about in real life. And because I have the visual reference, I'm able to keep myself consistent. The other nice thing is when you actually draw up a map like this and have it all plotted out, you're able to see what's consistent with the real world, what makes sense, and what only made sense in your head. When you actually have a visualization of it, you realize that sometimes what's in your head and what you were going to write doesn't make sense when you compare it to how planets and landscapes actually form in the real world, which is very important if you're writing science fiction, obviously less important if you're writing fantasy. Something else that's really, really great about drawing up a map like this is it does a lot of your world building for you. You can literally save yourself pages of exposition by just drawing up a map like this. And like I said, I drew my version over on the right in MS Paint, and then I sent it away to an artist to have the nice quality one made. And of course, you see these blacked out spots. That's stuff that I'm keeping secret deliberately from you watching this video because it's spoilers. And the version of the map in my book won't have that stuff in there either because, again, spoilers. And you can use the map to be a great piece of supplemental world building that saves you pages and pages of writing. And for people who are more visual, you know, the people who are visual learners, having that map might literally make the difference between the book and its geography and landscapes and what country is where. It might make the difference between them being able to follow that and having absolutely no idea about any of it. So I highly recommend, if you have any kind of a great landscape, a big area that your story takes place in, I highly recommend you draw up a map. Now, I have written up a couple of basic pointers, 1 through 9, that you can apply to any world building and go from the ground up. This is basically my thought process when I was building my own world with my best friend, Wes, and we really did. We started from the ground up and we said, this is what we're gonna do, and we did it in an order, and we just wrote, like I said, we wrote down everything we were gonna do, and we fleshed the idea out a little bit, moved on to the next thing, and then at the end, we checked it all for seamless consistency. So, without further ado, my tips on how to sequentially build your world from the ground up. We build the literal world. That's always step one. You build your planet from the dirt up, sometimes from the space dust up, depending on how detailed and how far back in history you want to go. You give it a unique solar system. You give it geography. You give it a climate. You decide what the days are like. You decide what the nights are like. You decide what the seasons are like. Maybe your planet has 10 seasons that are all distinct from each other. Maybe your planet has very unique geography and seasonal correlations where you have 2 parts of the world it's winter and 2 parts it's summer, and over here in this corner of the world it's spring. You can do anything when you're writing fantasy, and you could probably even get away with that in sci-fi if you were clever enough and understood the science of climate and geology good enough. So, sky's the limit when it comes to building your world from scratch. Be creative. As long as the world fits the story you're trying to tell and it's logically consistent by the end, go nuts. Number 2, you pick your world's chemistry, physics, magic system, etc., etc., etc. You decide on the rules your world runs by. Most people just use real world physics and never think twice about it because we're so used to real world physics. Some people take liberties with physics. Some people use basic physics but then put a magic system in place. Some people augment real world physics with a magic system. And some people throw physics to the window in favor of doing whatever the hell they want. And all of these are legitimate, again, as long as it complements the story and doesn't make your story too ridiculous to pleasantly follow. Third, we add the biosphere. Flora, fauna, crustaceans, fish, insects, bacteria, viruses, sentient races. Again, all these things are something you need to think about. You can use the well-established fantasy races if you like. I invented a couple of animals and races, and I think that it's about high time we stopped sucking at the Tolkien teat and more writers did that. I really think some originality of thought is overdue in this world, if I do say so myself. And so we should all strive as writers to be a little bit more original and stop using elves and orcs for every damn thing. Number 4, we write our world's history. Now, you can either go the Tolkien route on this and be very detailed and give a long, all-encompassing account of your world's history from creation up until current day. That's cool. I have no problem with that. Just make sure you don't bludgeon your readers over the head with exposition to do it. Remember, even if you wrote this big long history, you don't necessarily need to share it all with your readers in one book, okay? You can give them snippets of it as is needed to support and augment the story, but don't cram 4 pages of expositional history into a book just because you wrote it and you want to share it with your reader. And just because you wrote it doesn't make it interesting. Sorry. The other route you can go is, of course, the mysterious and aloof route. I can't remember the guy's name, but the guy who wrote the complete book of swords, which was actually a compilation of the other books of swords that he wrote. But yeah, that book, the complete book of swords, was very stingy with the history it gave you. It really made you try to piece together the history from the little scraps that he dropped throughout the world. And I don't doubt for a minute that he had a full idea of his world's fictional history in his head when he wrote those books, because it was all very seamless and it all made sense. And I couldn't find any holes in the world. Granted, I was like only 10 or 11 when I read it, so if there were and you remember them and they irritate you and you can't get over it, don't blow up on me. I was still kind of young when I read those books. But my point is that he didn't just give you tons of information about the history of his world. The scraps were kind of littered throughout the story, and you pick them up and try to put them together. And that is great in a totally different way. And then sometimes, depending on the story you're trying to tell, it makes a lot more sense and is more enjoyable for the reader. So again, just make sure your world building fits the story you're trying to tell and the characters that are in it, thematically, logically, and spiritually, in terms of the spirit of your work. If you're writing a dark and mysterious story, your world should be dark and mysterious. Makes sense, right? Next, in quick, rapid succession, 5, we create society. 6, we create culture. 7, we create government and religion. And these three things I gave to you all in quick succession because they're all kind of intertwined. They all make up how humans organize ourselves into groups, and how we set social rules, and how we order ourselves. So all of those things are very closely intertwined. Society, government, religion, culture. And those things are all distinct. Remember, you can have multiple cultures within one society. You can even have more than one government in society. You can have many religions inside society. But society as a whole has to function after all of these things are thrown into it, or else we'd evolve into chaos, right? So there has to be something that's unifying. So remember that when you're building your world. Remember that if you have a bunch of these different groups and they're all living together in a fairly tight space, remember there has to be something unifying. A universal language, a universal religion, a universal enemy, something that makes these people choose to keep being nice to each other. On to number 8. We create the unique settings that we're going to be using in the story. The specific places that our cast of characters will be spending time. So that's places like Dresden's house, the pub he goes to. That's places like Hogwarts. That's places like the camp from Lightning Thief. Okay? These are all places that were one of the main settings in the story they're in. And they're important, and they need to be distinct, and they need to be unique and detailed, because one of the main things that clues a reader into the idea that this is a main setting, that this is a place we're going to be returning to, is how detailed it is, how much you describe it, and how well they can imagine it in their mind. If you get detailed down to the amount of dust on shelves, then the reader's really able to start building an atmosphere in their head. However, that is a double-edged sword. So remember, you need to be colorful with your descriptive language. You need to be concise. You need to portray a lot of information as quickly as you can so that you can get on with the story, because the modern reader doesn't want 4 pages of describing a room. If you spend a page describing a room with a lot of readers, you're pushing your luck. So make sure you get your description in. It's thorough, detailed, and well written, but you don't drone on. Okay? And then number 9, you might have guessed, is double check your work. Run it through the logic filter. Make sure it's all consistent. This is its own step, because you might find that once you have everything else done and you go back and start double checking yourself, you realize a bunch of components in your world don't fit with each other at all. Make no damn sense. I did that when I was writing my book. There was some stuff that I really wanted to put in. There were some ideas I really wanted to use, but I was like, it just doesn't make sense. Just does not hold up under any kind of scrutiny when you put it in the context of my story. And so as much as I wanted to include them, and mostly in the form of races that I wanted to include, I just couldn't, because it wouldn't have made sense with the story. It would have been like, well, what the hell was the point of that? You know, it would have bogged down on the logical integrity of my plot. So double check your work, run it through the logic filter, use a writing companion or someone you trust their creative ideas and their creative insight to run through the work with you and act as sort of a double safety to make sure that you catch everything, to make sure that you don't miss something that's just not obvious to you because it makes perfect sense in your head. Okay? Having someone to help you with that is great. Like I said, I had my best friend Wes. God rest him, a magnificent bastard. And now that we're at the end of the video, my closing note is a reminder. Just because you wrote it doesn't make it interesting. Your world needs to be fleshed out. You need to have all of these connections formed. You need to have your ecosystems functional. You need everything logically consistent. But just because you wrote it doesn't mean the reader needs to read it. You need it so that you can put your story in a fully fleshed out world that's logically consistent, where the characters know the rules, know how things function, and have a unique world to run around and discover alongside the reader. That's the purpose of designing a new world, is to fascinate the reader with all these new wonderful things. But we don't want to read 4 pages of exposition. We want to discover them as the story progresses. And so, if you drop little tidbits of your world as you go, that's usually ideal. If you made a bunch of new interesting stuff, throw it into the story organically as you go. Don't stop for a page and explain the history behind a plant when it has absolutely no relevance to the story. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, if I can't just tell my reader all this stuff, why do I need to write it? And here's why. You need to know what your world is like so that you don't trip over yourself. If your world building is half-assed or incomplete, you're going to find that as you write your story. Your characters will find it as you move them through the world. And then you'll have to go back and finish your own world building, and it's going to create inconsistencies. It's going to create holes that you now need to fill in your world building. And it's very likely to create inconsistencies with the writing that already exists, or plot holes down the line. And so, having a fully fleshed out world before you ever start writing your story prevents that. It saves you a headache in the long run. So even if you never get to show your reader 90% of your world, flesh it out. Trust me, just do it. It's a little bit of legwork up front to save you a whole lot of hassle down the line. A good telltale sign of the fact that you didn't do enough world building is if you start relying on contrivances, coincidences, acts of God, or just good old-fashioned ass pulls to close a seam that tore open in your world building. You need to go back and fix it. And then you need to read through everything you've already written to make sure that it's all consistent with the new addition to the world building that you should have done in the first place. So, one more time to beat you over the head with it. Finish your world building before you start your story. Please. And remember, if you're worried that if your world is too fleshed out and you put too much time and thought into building it, it's going to feel stale and overthought to your reader, I disagree. I think that's completely the wrong way of thinking about it. Paradoxically, if you build a really well fleshed out, seamless world, and it's logically consistent, and you straighten all the wrinkles, and it all holds up under a basic train of thought, paradoxically, that feels very organic and natural to the reader. So, outline your story, outline your world, check it all for consistency before you start writing your damn book. Alright guys, tomorrow there's going to be a Music Monday. It's a special Music Monday for Black History Month. I wanted to do at least one video. So if you are a fan of classic rock and you enjoy celebrating some of the really awesome culture given to us by our brothers and sisters of color, check back in tomorrow for that video. Till then guys, peace.